press hostility and bias that should bother us. It's not just the negative and hysterical tone of the coverage, it's the brazen, outright dishonesty. Sadly, the lies as well.
My definition of terrorism, that is a $64,000 question. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, who was British ambassador to the UN, tried to put a resolution through with the US on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and there was no definition of terrorism in there. And the other countries at the UN Security Council said, well, what's your definition of terrorism? He said, it's like an elephant. We all know it when we see it. Of course, it's not that simplistic. People have different definitions. Governments have different definitions. The British government has redefined it several times over the last 10, 20 years. My own definition would be the use of violence against civilians, against non-combatants for political purposes. Of course, that's a quite controversial definition because that would then bring governments into the definition of terrorism. We tend not to define governments as terrorists. State terrorism never really gets a look in, and therefore it's often described, for example, in the US, they add in the line by subgroups. In order to make clear that they're not talking about governments. But I think, look, most people would accept that if you blow people up or kill innocent civilians to make a political point, that is terrorism.
Being a prominent Muslim figure in the media, do you believe your faith promotes violence and terrorism?
Shock, horror, surprise, surprise. No, I don't, because if it did, then I probably wouldn't be an adherent of that faith. No, I don't believe that at all. In fact, I've written extensively on this subject. I wrote a column recently about how the jihadists who are going out to fight in Syria and Iraq for ISIS and other such groups tend not to have a clue about Islam. You know, there were two guys who came back, were prosecuted in the Midlands, British-born Muslims who went out to fight for ISIS, and in the trial it emerged that the two books they bought before they left on Amazon were Quran for Dummies and and Islam for Dummies, sorry. There isn't a jihad for dummies as far as I'm aware. But those are the books they bought. So I think that speaks volumes about how the religious stuff comes later as a kind of cover for your actions. These guys are motivated by a range of political, social, economic, psychosocial, foreign policy factors, and religion plays a role. But to pretend that Islam motivates people to become terrorists is a complete fallacy. And I think journalists and academics and experts are now starting to say that more. I think it's becoming more common for people to push back against that trope.
What is the actual cause of terrorism and how do you think it should be tackled?
These are $64,000 sweeping questions. I wish I had the answers to all of these. There is no single cause for terrorism. It depends what conflict you're in, what country you're in, what era you're in. There are a variety of factors that leads to someone becoming radicalized or turning towards violence. In fact, most experts like Mark Sageman, the former CIA forensic psychiatrist and profiler, he says that he doesn't even accept there is such a thing as radicalization. He makes the point that there is no accepted consensus view on why someone, even with the most extreme beliefs, takes that final step towards translating those beliefs into violent action. We're actually quite far away from understanding why it is that people turn to violence. We still don't really know why they take that extreme final step. In terms of kind of root causes, which is a phrase that's often used, there's a variety of things. If you look at young men going out to fight from Britain, a lot of them are disillusioned, a lot of them are alienated from society, a lot of them have no hope or ambition in their lives. They are, Chris Morris, the writer of Four Lions, famously said terrorism is about ideology, but it's also about Burkes. It's also about idiotic, rather closed-minded young men with nothing better to do with their time, looking for glamour, looking for excitement, looking for a cause. It's much better to be, in some people's views, unfortunately, it's much better to be standing in the desert with a knife to someone's throat, addressing the President of the United States directly, live on the internet, than it is to be a kind of assistant store manager in Primark in Portsmouth. And, with the great respect to Primark, that probably isn't the most, ambitious or electrifying or exciting thing you want to do with your life. Now, we have to find a way to give young men, and they do tend to be young men, more hope and a better reason for not joining these extremist groups. But let's be very clear, what we call terrorism today, there's a lot of commonality. The reason why people join terrorist groups today is why they joined gangs yesterday, is why they joined anarchist groups in the 60s and 70s, or Marxist groups in Europe, or the IRA. I mean, there's very, very similar causes and factors to do with alienation and anger and looking for some kind of new identity. Do I believe the governments of the US and UK benefit from global terrorism? Not in a kind of conspiratorial, they're behind the attacks, which is a very common trope, unfortunately, in some Muslim communities, which is the Israeli government did 9/11, the American government did 9/11, it was an inside job, the British government did 7/7 in order to make the case for foreign wars. No, I don't believe that. That's nonsensical, it's naive, there's zero evidence for it. What I would say about benefit is it's clearly the case that certain vested interests do well out of foreign conflicts. That's indisputable. In fact, a Foreign Office official once said to me, she said with a straight face, that war is good for the economy. There are, if you're an arms seller, if you're a defence manufacturing company, your stock prices tend to go up in times of war. If you're part of the so-called terrorism industry, if you're one of these experts who turns up on Sky News or CNN to pontificate about Islamism or Sayyid Qutb or Hezbollah or whatever it is, you do well out of foreign wars. If you are a part of the homeland security industry in America, selling security apparatus to governments, you do well out of foreign wars. If you're the media love a good foreign war. It's great to cover, it's exciting, it's glamorous, it's adventurous, it's good for ratings. Now, that doesn't mean that any of these vested interests are behind terrorist attacks. That's a bit Hollywood-esque and mad and conspiratorial for my liking. But clearly, there is a vested interest in hyping things up. You look at terrorism itself. Why is it so hyped up by the media? It is hyped up by the media. The fact is that if you're an American, for example, you're petrified about being killed by Al-Qaeda, and yet you're more likely to drown in your bathtub than you are to be killed by a terrorist. You're more likely to be hit by a bolt of lightning than be killed by a terrorist. You're more likely to be killed by an asteroid hitting the planet Earth than you are to be killed by a terrorist group on the US soil. That's what the statistics show. And yet we arrange our whole lives, how we fly, how we take security measures in public places, all based around this terrorist threat. Billions of dollars are made. In Nebraska, I read that there was an anti-terrorist fence built around a hospital. In North Carolina, I believe there were cows that were protected from a biological attack by Al-Qaeda. It's kind of bizarre and weird places where there's never really going to be any kind of terrorist attack. People are spending millions of dollars protecting against it. So clearly, for some people, there is a benefit in all this fear and hyping and scaremongering.
How much do various industry lobbyists benefit from terrorism?
As I say, for many people, war is good for the economy. There is a huge pressure from arms sellers and defence industries and manufacturers to sell weapons, to make sure that there are threats out there and hyped up in order to justify the renewal of Trident. What's that supposed to protect us from? The new nuclear weapons upgrade. Who are we going to use that against? North Korea, really? We're going to war with them? Little old UK on our own? So clearly there are vested interests when it comes to the defence industry. There's a reason why austerity never hits any of these big budget weapon systems. There's a reason why the Pentagon spends more than the next 20 countries put together on the US military budget. And that's because there are people lobbying for it. There are people claiming we need this spending. And, you know, it was Dwight Eisenhower, the former general and former US president, who said in his farewell address that, you know, every bomb and every bullet that's made takes away bread, food from a hungry child.
What's your best advice for people who don't quite understand the sensationalist and fear-mongering media climate?
It's a real issue in terms of how you fight misinformation on any front, not just on the security, Islam, terrorism front, but on the front of immigration and asylum, welfare. There are lots of public policy debates which are seen through the prism of a very narrow right-wing media agenda, which gives you only one side of the argument, if that, which skews the facts and statistics, if they even bother to use facts and statistics. And therefore you have a great deal of misinformation about immigration, where people think there are twice as many immigrants in the country as there are, about welfare fraud, where people think it's on a much bigger scale, 10 times as much as it actually is, and in terms of Islam, where people are fearful of Islam and Muslims, and when you ask them, have you actually met a Muslim? No. What's their source of information about Islam? It's from the media. So you have a real problem there. How do you tackle that? How do you fight back against that? It's very difficult, given the omnipresence of the media, given the fact we live in a second-hand world, where we do get most of our information about things from TV, radio, and now the internet, and given how the internet, some people say, is a great salvation. In some ways it is. Social media has allowed you to find different sources of information. It's allowed ordinary people to get their voices heard and bypass the gatekeepers of the mainstream media. On the other hand, social media also helps embolden the far right. It helps all sorts of loons and fascists and hate mongers and phobes to anonymously push out their hate and nonsense and smears and allow lies to go around the world before the truth has time to put its boots on. It allows unverified stories to go viral. It's a real problem I have with social media. People don't check the sources of what they're forwarding around on their emails and WhatsApps. So even that's not a silver bullet to say, well, social media, Twitter and Facebook, that's how we're going to fight back against mainstream media misinformation. I don't think there is any one simple solution. I think there are lots of steps we have to take. We need to get more people from diverse backgrounds working within the media, crucially. We need to get rid of the groupthink in the mainstream media, especially in the British press. We need better regulation so that when things go wrong, when untruths are published, when people are wrongly smeared, there is some form of redress. It's only fair. We need a greater awareness, public awareness of some of the downsides and some of the misinformation that's coming out of the media. So we need more grassroots campaigns. We need better lobbying of the media, because at the end of the day, newspapers are well lobbied and well represented in terms of people from the 1%, in terms of ownership, in terms of people working there, in terms of people who have access to newsrooms, to editors. And therefore we need a lot more grassroots lobbying and grassroots efforts, but there's no simple solution. And I don't think we can just pretend to say, oh well, nobody's reading newspapers anymore, it's great now, the internet will solve everything. A, that's not true. Newspapers still have big audiences, still have a lot of influence, and B, as I say, social media is not a silver bullet.
And finally, how do you feel about think tanks that manipulate findings to fit their funders' agendas?
I think in any civil society debate or public policy debate, think tanks and independent organisations and charities and pressure groups have a big role to play. It's something to be proud of, that we live in countries where they are key parts of civil society. You'll see in more repressive countries, dictatorships, one of the symbols of the repression of the dictatorship is there aren't independent organisations or privately funded organisations or charitable organisations which are able to make cases in the public sphere, in the public space for policies, laws, changes of laws. We do have a problem in this country, especially in the United States, but also in the UK, where we have a range of think tanks now who are not so transparent when it comes to funding. That's a problem. You have groups like the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is often criticised for their staff go on the radio, go on the BBC, make the case against bans on smoking, and they don't point out that big tobacco is one of the big funders of the IEA. And people like George Monbiot of The Guardian have written about this extensively, that we need more transparency. When you have the Global Warming Policy Foundation, sounds very serious, authoritative, run by former Chancellor Nigel Lawson, makes the case against taking steps to tackle climate change. How much of the funding from there comes from big oil? How much of it comes from fossil fuel industry? We just don't know, because they won't tell us. So I think transparency is key. I think journalists should be less lazy when labelling these organisations as independent. They should make clear what the biases are if they can. They should try and find out what the funding issue is, if there is a funding issue. And I think, we also have great academia in this country. We have great universities. And I think there is this lazy reliance on very media-savvy think tanks who are very quick at getting their spokespersons on air. I'm talking about both on the right and on the left. And, actually we also have a lot more, I hate to use the word neutral, but a lot less partial or partisan academics who are doing actual academic peer-reviewed research in their fields. They're not so media savvy, they're not so easily contactable, and we hear less from them. I'd like to hear a lot more from them than I do from these kind of pseudo-experts, some of whom populate our think tank world. Having said that, there's also a lot of good think tanks, a lot of clever people, a lot of academics working at a lot of think tanks. Some of them are friends of mine, and they're doing a lot of good work, and you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but clearly that area needs reform, especially in media coverage. Journalists are very lazy. You come and give us a story or a report or a spokesperson for free, and we feel like the story's been done for us, and we put that report and that person on the airwaves or into our columns. And we need to be a little bit more discriminatory, I would argue.